Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest bonus episode of the Stephen King podcast. This is bonus episode number 14, and I have with me today Calgary writer Marc Watson. Hello, Marc.
Hello, Lou. Thank you very much for having me on the show today.
Not a problem, as we both probably are hiding under umbrellas this summer, as it's been raining nonstop, not kidding, almost every day for the last 3 weeks. It's been unbelievable.
It has, and especially with kid who plays baseball trying to cram all those games in between cloud bursts is an exercise in futility some days.
Yes. All right. So, Marc, why don't you tell us a little about yourself?
Absolutely. So as you said, my name is Marc Watson. I am a Calgary-based author. I've been I like to say an active author, somebody who's actually putting himself out there we're going on about 3.5 years now. And before that, it was mostly just writing for my own personal enjoyment. I was born and raised in Brampton, Ontario, and I moved out as soon as I graduated high school because I couldn't stand living in Southern Ontario anymore. Not that Southern Ontario isn't wonderful, but wasn't for me, and I knew that at a very young age, and I moved out, and I never looked back.
Did you have relatives out west or something? Like how did you know?
It was kind of strange actually, because when I was very young, like I'm talking like 3 or 4 years old, my father brought the whole family out to the Lower Mainland, mostly around Maple Ridge and Pitt Meadows and those kinds of areas just outside of Vancouver Prime. And we lived there for about 3 years or so, and then moved back and continued our lives in Brampton. And I don't know about yourself or any of the listeners, but I don't remember a whole lot before I was 3 years old. So all of my earliest memories were of growing up in the Lower Mainland. And I figured I wanted to just keep going back there. And that's exactly what I did. My sister did the exact same thing at about the same age. She was a bit older than me, so she had a head start. But she moved out. And then a few years later, I did the same thing. And we both have been happily living out west ever since.
Oh, and did you drag your parents with you eventually, or no?
No, not at all. My parents separated when I was 10. So in truth, my father does live here now. He lived in a few other places, but eventually he made his way to Calgary because he's got grandkids here and it made sense for him. But my mother and my stepfather are still in Southern Ontario, as is most of my immediate family. I don't have a very big family. I come from a small family. I leave the big family up to my wife. But everybody is pretty much out there.
Okay. So with all this push and pull between the East and West, when did you develop the writing?
I really primarily developed it back in high school. It mostly kind of kicked in about grade 11. I had been kind of influenced by a lot of the popular culture of the time, and I had also really gotten into a lot of what was coming out of Japan, be it movies or anime or the stories that were being told. It very much was the stories that I wanted to hear. They were more mature. I thought that they were more fleshed out in a lot of ways, and they influenced me to start writing. And in grade 11, I almost failed, honestly, because I was so busy and wrapped up writing my own thing, and I did it all by hand. It was a trilogy that I wrote that a lot of my stories still live in, and I've never really done anything with it. The God's honest truth is where I'm sitting right now. That original handwritten binder is just off to my right now. I always keep it around. It's never very far from me in my writing ventures because it reminds me where I came from. And I write all through each class pretty much. And it was only by the grace of an extremely understanding English teacher, as I think a lot of English teachers have to be, and with some last minute crunching at the end of the school year that I was able to actually sneak out of grade 11 and move on. But ever since then, I realized that I was willing to sacrifice a lot just to get the story that I wanted to tell out, even if nobody was ever going to read it. And it's kind of continued on ever since then. I have a bunch of other binders of handwritten notes and other things that I'm sure a lot of authors can relate to.
That's interesting. Handwriting, is that, jumping ahead a little bit, is that how you write today as well, or have you moved to a keyboard?
I've moved strictly to keyboard. practically abandoned pen and paper in just about every conceivable way. I am a very much technologically oriented person. I always have been. I don't want to be necessarily ahead of the curve, but I always want to be with it. So
Sure.
Inventions like the cloud, working in things like Google and what is it?
Dropbox.
Yeah, exactly. Like all those things where I can I've got a note, I got an idea, I'm on my tablet, I can make a note in that, and I put it in a doc file or something, and then I can
Google Doc. Yep.
and then I can pick it up on my phone if I get another idea. It's just that continuing idea of I always have a pad of paper with me. It's just in a digital form.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned pop culture gave you the spark here. Was there any particular piece of pop culture that sparked you to write?
There was two very specific ones.
Okay.
The first of which, tying back to something I mentioned in an email earlier, was Wizard and Glass, the fourth Dark Tower book by Stephen King. Because
nicely done, sir. Getting that Stephen King reference in there.
I have to slide it in. But it's the God's honest truth, because I had read the first three and they were a little bit advanced for me at the time, particularly Wastelands. Right. And when I got to Wizard and Glass, my mind was really focused on the story that was being told within the story. For any of the listeners who aren't familiar with the story in particular, it is a Roland the Gunslinger story, but it's mostly a flashback book, and it's telling this incredibly interesting story about Roland when he was younger, just after he had earned his guns as a gunslinger. And the way that it crafted that story, it was very, very human in this very alien world. The other part that had really influenced me was, as I said, a lot of different kinds of anime and those mature stories that were coming out, but particularly it was definitely Neon Genesis Evangelion and the original series plus the movie at the end. And when I was watching that was my brain exploding moment when I realized that animation and just fiction in general could be this beautiful, confusing, conflicting, painful, joyful art form that I wanted to contribute to. And it could also have giant robots, and that was okay too. Those two things could live together. They weren't just sandwiched in books of prose versus watching the Transformers on Saturday mornings when I was a kid. They could very much all these fantastical ideas could live together, and I could contribute to that. I could put something out in the world with that.
Right. Very cool. So you've already mentioned King as a writer that you was obviously reading during that time period. What were some of the other authors that you were big on?
I always feel the need to extol the virtues of the young adult author, and that's because my favorite author of all time, even if I don't really read his stuff anymore, is a young adult author out of Southern Ontario by the name of Gordon Corman. And at that time, even though I was a little bit too young for a lot of King, but a little bit too old for most of the things that Gordon Corman was writing, I was still reading his things because his story was so inspirational to me as a young writer. I admit I never really took the bull by the horns by that. And by his story, I mean, he wrote his first manuscript when he was about 12 or 13 years old. And it was published by the time he was 14. It was just like a wacky young adult comedy called This Can't Be Happening at MacDonald Hall. He's gone on to make more MacDonald Hall books and a lot of other really great series. He's had a couple of his stories turned into made-for-TV movies that I've seen on YTV, which I think are fantastic.
Cool.
But his story was like, he was not much older than me when I started really reading his stuff. And when I found out, I was like, oh my God. And he's from Southern Ontario, and he's got all this success. And it showed me that I could do these kinds of things if I just applied myself. But then life happened, and I didn't do it for a long time.
Right.
I also read a lot of Terry Brooks. At this point, I admit it's a little bit more out of habit than anything else, because I had almost kind of given up, particularly on the Shannara series I'm referencing. I came a little bit later, and I just read them, and I wasn't even really planning on reading them as much as I did, but he released another series that was called the Word and Void Trilogy, and I read those. So that way I was like, okay, so I'm not really diving into Shannara. I can't get into this. It's just such a giant beast. I'm going to read these basically because I liked his writing. Right. And then he finishes that trilogy and is like, oh, by the way, this is the start of Shannara. This is a giant prequel hundreds of years before the Sword of Shannara. So, you're already in. I'm just like, well, I guess I'm just going to have to continue reading these. Yep. And I've read them all the way through, and now they're ending. I believe the last one will come out next year as far as the Shannara series goes, moving on to bigger and better things. And so, as I said, at this point, I'm kind of reading them out of habit. Like, I've made it this far. I'm not going to stop with 4.
Right, right. Okay, so you're reading all this fantasy stuff, and at what point did you buckle down and become serious about writing? And what did you do to bolster your craft?
Oh, I can tell you the exact moment. It was at my lunch break, sitting at my desk at work on February 29th of 2016. So
Wow.
the leap day.
Right,
The only reason I remember is because it was the leap day. But
right.
I remember I was sitting there, and for about a month or two before that moment, I had been batting around ideas of putting together a poutine review website for Calgary. My master plan, my grand plan was that someday somebody would pay me to eat poutine, and that was really just like that's like every young Canadian's dream that doesn't involve hockey, is that somebody will just give you poutine for free.
Yeah.
But the writing had really kind of inspired me, and I had been sitting on the manuscript for Catching Hell Part 1 and 2 for a long time. I wrote it for myself because I had a story to tell, and then I kind of clicked to the fact that, hey, I wrote a book, and I'm doing all these, like all this time that I'm spending writing poutine reviews and stuff, which I was just doing for fun, and I was giving it like this like wacky comedy bent. And I realized at that moment on that day, hey, let's do something about this. Let us find out what it takes, because you're just going to sit there sitting on it, Mark. So you might as well put it out there. And so almost immediately I was like, that's it. I'm going to be a writer now. I'm going to be a writer who puts himself out there and advertises himself as such. You can kind of walk with a bit of writer swagger now, as opposed to just a writer hiding in the shadows. And I signed up for writing courses at Athabasca University. I took a number of those. I still kind of continue them as time has gone on and time allows. I started talking to editors, and I started talking to other people in the industry. And I mean, that was in February. And then here in Calgary, we have an annual writers conference called When Words Collide. And I signed up for that almost right away. I'm like, by the time that comes around in August, like this is in March that I'm thinking this, by the time it comes in August, I'm going to be prepared for this. I'm going to get myself out there. There was going to be pitch meetings, and I was throwing myself into the deep end, even though it was a few months away. And then, yeah, I started writing the query letters, and I started sending them out, and just getting myself involved in that universe. I created my social media presence, which I still maintain to this day. My wife is a graphic designer. She helped me with my website, and she did all the work for that. And
That's nice.
yeah. Oh, yeah, I know. I've been told a few times that, oh, you're a lucky one. Can you do one for me? And it took her enough time to do it for me, and she loves me and is the mother of my children. So she does not have the kind of time. And now, for the most part, I've mastered WordPress pretty good. So I think that I'm doing a pretty good job looking after it myself.
Okay.
But yeah, it was all these kind of little things, these little tiny leaps that I took to further my craft, to improve my writing, to improve my social media presence, and just to improve the writer persona that is Marc Watson.
Mm-hmm. Well, very cool. I'm just curious about Athabasca University. Are you taking a creative writing course or working towards a degree? Is it just general?
It's just general, honestly. I think about things that I was trying to really improve myself on. Like, I am a writer who, even though I made it through high school just fine, despite that 1 year hiccup because I was writing too much, when I got out, I still have incredible difficulty knowing the difference between nouns and verbs and adverbs and proper punctuation.
Right.
I do. I think of it the same way that I cannot read music. I took guitar lessons for 4 years, and I could not play you a note right now. And I was pretty dedicated. Like, I really wanted to learn how to play guitar, and my mom was very supportive of me in that. And I could not read music, no matter how hard I tried. And it's very much that same kind of thing in my brain, where if I see a sentence, I don't break it down like I've heard a lot of authors describe the way that they break it down a sentence to make sure it's constructed the right way. I'm just writing things out, and I'm like, I need to tighten up this technically a little bit more. I might not ever know the difference between verbs and adverbs, but I'm going to make a solid effort to do that. So I first started with introduction courses of different kinds and working on creative writing, and also some in business as well, because technical writing is it's not just a job that people can have. Technical writing is technical writing. There's a different kind of language that you use when you're technically writing.
Yep.
And I thought that was very important to learn as well. And in the job that I have, it's not something that I really get to stretch all that much. So I need to make sure that I keep pushing myself to keep learning that, because there's only so far I'm going to be able to go with my company knowing how to be a really good writer. I mean, I love the company I work for, but writing is not really involved. So it's not a really long game for me right now when it comes to education, but it is something that I want to continue doing. At some point, I might stumble into a degree, but I'm not going to count the days until that happens.
Okay, so let's dive a little bit in now into your writing process and your work schedule, because considering that you're a father and with children and you have a regular job, so how are you structuring your time to get your writing done?
I like to use the analogy of it's just like eating an elephant. It's one bite at a time, because I only have about 45 minutes to an hour during my work lunch break to write. And that's when I started. So when I first wrote Catching Hell, that's what I was doing. I was in a different position in the company I was with, and it was more of a labor job. And so I was physically, it was demanding, but mentally I didn't have a whole lot to really tax me there. So I would steal away into an empty cubicle at my office with my laptop, and I would just start writing for an hour. And that's kind of how I stretched my brain muscles. And then I'd move on. And after a year, I had this 250,000 word behemoth. I'm like, well, that's a little bit too big, but I did it. But I realized how much can get done in just that short period of time. I'm not a very effective writer at night or on my days off if I have time. I do have the occasional Friday off just by the way that my schedule works. But what writing I do then is usually related to working on short story things that don't require me thinking of this broad scope that I've created, or it's dedicated to social media and website updates and all these other kind of little things that aren't fun in a creative sense, but they're kind of a necessary beast. So that's how I do it. I have that little window every single day, and sometimes I use it for other stuff. Maybe there's a video I really want to watch, or a Netflix series comes out that maybe my wife doesn't want to partake in. But it's just those tiny little chunks, at least 3 or 4 times a week, where I can sit down and I can just write for 45 minutes to an hour. And because I did most of my most effective writing when I was younger in high school, I'm very much used to doing that writing at work at my little cubicle. I work in like a stereotypical Dilbert computer cubicle, and there's people around me, and it's just the sound of business going on around me. That is a good friend who described it as pink noise. It's not the red noise of aggressiveness and like construction workers, but it's not white noise that you put in the background. It's somewhere kind of in between.
Right.
So that's how I do it. Small bites.
Okay. And curious, are you a pantser or a plotter?
It really depends on what it is I'm planning on working on. If there's something specific that I should be working on, then I will plot it a little bit. But 95% of the time, I am a pantser. It really is by the seat of my pants. Like when I wrote Catching Hell and it was this big long thing, I knew the beginning, I knew the ending, I knew the characters, and I was just kind of going along on the journey as well. And the journey ended up being really big, but it was not something that I had planned. I was just kind of like, oh, I wonder what's going to happen to these characters next. Like I should know because I'm the guy writing it, but I didn't. I just knew what that end goal was and how they got from point A to point B. That was exciting for me to find out. And everything I've written of any consequence has always been by the seat of my pants.
Okay, that's interesting because with a 45 to an hour chunk of your day to write with, I was expecting you to say that you were a plotter, but it's surprising how many people pants. And I guess it's only surprising to me because when I write, I plot ahead of time because otherwise I have a tendency to get right into dead ends and I just don't like to waste that time. But other people seem to be pretty cool with just going with the flow and working it that way, which is interesting.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about when you're talking about writing into dead ends. It's something that I did a few times, and there were times when I just had to throw away big chunks because I started to go down a road. I'm like, this is going to end up someplace where I don't want it to be. And I was okay with throwing things out. I eliminated an entire main character from the story just because after like my sixth edit, I'm like, this character, I love this character. I always planned on it being a 3 protagonist story, and he doesn't work. I'm going to make it a 2 protagonist story. I'm going to take his character beats and his story arc and blend it into these other characters that I had, one of which was one of the main characters, and I never regretted it. Like, I spent a long time just then going through and editing out all of the theys and turning them to he's and all these other little things, and I was like, I don't miss that character, and I think it works better as it is, as a dichotomy between these 2 characters versus one character going in one direction and 2 in the other direction. It worked better that way, so I was okay with cutting it out. I didn't feel any pain about it, but sometimes I think about that character. Maybe I should find a way to sneak him back in. He stuck with me for a long time. He might have earned a cameo somewhere.
Right. Okay, so you've referenced your books a couple of times now. Why don't you expand upon exactly what it's a duology, correct?
Yes, yeah, that's right.
Okay, so tell us about Catching Hell.
Yeah, so Catching Hell, as you said, it's a duology. It originally started as one giant story, but amazingly, none of the publishers out there in the world are really looking for a 250,000 word first book by anybody with absolutely no name behind them or any kind of support. So after speaking with some people, I had the idea to break it into 2 separate stories, and I think that the 2 stories really kind of stand on their own. So I have Catching Hell Part 1, Journey. So it's the story of 2 young men whose home is destroyed by a robotic army, which, although they knew that things like technology existed, they live in a world where it's almost kind of taboo. So now they seek revenge by heading out into the world. And so you have Aryu, who goes on one adventure. He's a young man who has mysterious wings and has recently found a weapon that seems to have some kind of, I'm going to call it magic for lack of a better term. This is very much a world of fantasy meets technology, and Aryu goes into the world of the fantastical and the mythical to try and learn his craft and find his power, whereas his best friend Johan travels into the world of the technological and the more futuristic, which his people have also shunned and kept at arm's length. So it's the story of the 2 of them as this catastrophe happens to them, and they separate and they go their own separate ways, and the characters and the people that they meet along the way. The second one, if the first one is my road story, if the first one is my Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring almost, then the second part is almost entirely my Battle of Pelennor Fields. It is my war story. It is the 2 characters having lived in this world for a period of time and gaining what they believe they need to seek their revenge, and then slowly coming back together unknowingly as like a vice on each side of their enemy. And though it's almost entirely a battle story, it is, and it's not really spoiling anything to say that. I'm very clearly leading up to some kind of a battle once this story begins and the exciting incident happens. And it's my action story. It's the story that carries these characters home. Okay,
and this is a young adult series.
I'd like to say that it is kind of a advanced young adult. There are some things like some saucy language and some imagery that I wouldn't necessarily put into the hands of the average 13 or 14-year-old, but I would say 16 and up is kind of what my target was here, because that's what I was when I was consuming the kind of things that inspired this.
Right. What are the age of the characters in the book?
They are never clearly defined. I leave it up to the reader to say. They have recently returned from a quest of manhood, so it's not unreasonable to say they're somewhere around the range of 16, 17 years old, which is about what I was when I went on a very similar trip.
Okay, and both of these books are out and available at this time?
Yes, that's right. So Journey and Destination are both available from Double Dragon eBooks and Double Dragon Press, and they are on any and all digital formats for the ebook readers and can be ordered from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, all of the big dogs.
Okay, so Double Dragon Press, did you work with the editor?
I did for primarily the second one. The first one, because of the way that things kind of came together, I wanted to get it out there on my own. In retrospect, there were some things that I think I probably should have shaved down, but that was the mistake of a first-time author. So that's why I made sure that I tightened it up with the second one. And through the magic of publishing release windows, I actually had another book picked up by another publisher that was released first before these two, even though these were picked up ahead of time, because Double Dragon had a 12 to 18 month publication window. And then my first novel, Death Dresses Poorly, was picked up by Fluky Fiction out of Maine, and they had about a 6 to 8 month release window. So they were both kind of picked up around the same time, but then this one came out first. But the owner and main editor for Fluky Fiction was kind enough to step in and help me edit Destination, because I really enjoyed working with her. She was fantastic. I love the work that she did with my first book. And I'm not going to get into the long and sordid story about how I had to get the second part published, but a part of it was Double Dragon saying it would be a really big help if you could do that side of it, and then this is what we'll do for you on our side of it, and we'll still be able to release it when we're planning on releasing it. So it came together well, and I think that one was put together a lot better, a lot better, a little tighter story, better edited. But not that I'm not proud of the first one. I just, like any author, once I go back and look at it, I'm like, ooh, here's some things I probably would have changed.
Yeah, no doubt. That's pretty common, I think. I'm curious, again, this is part of your writing process, but do you have beta readers? Do you have a first reader? Is your wife your first reader?
For Catching Hell, no. I really wanted to put that story out on its own merits. I didn't really want it to be influenced by the beta readers, because it was a story that had been very close to me. I had lived mentally kind of in that world since I was in high school, because it does tie loosely to the stories that I'd written then. But also, by the time I was ready to release Catching Hell, or at least start putting it out there, I'd already been sitting on it, or writing it and then editing it and doing things with it for 5 years. I'm like, no, that's my story. I'm going to leave that one alone. If people don't like it as it is, at least I did it on my own terms. For Death Dresses Poorly, I did have my wife, I actually read it to her. My wife and I kind of have this thing where I will read her stories. I read her all of the Harry Potter books. Like, we would sit down at night before we had kids, and I would just read to her. And she's not a huge reader, so this was an easy way for us to spend some quality time together, but also for us to both read stories that we enjoyed. And we've done it with other books, but I did it with Death Dresses Poorly. And so I listened to her feedback primarily to the point where the main character, who is Ethan, originally had our oldest son's name. I used it because it still kind of jived with the character that he was, a kind of a 20-something millennial kind of name. And
there you go.
He's not a very enviable character. So my wife's like, would you be able to just change his name? So I was like, yeah, absolutely. I can change his name. So like the two characters shared nothing in common. Like, well, the character and the person, my son, share nothing in common other than a name. But she's like, I just people know you, and my family might read it or friends might read it, and let's not draw this association. I'm like, that is a fair criticism. I think we can probably make that work.
Right. Okay, so you've got 3 books out. What are you working on now?
Right now, I'm working on a lot of short story stuff that I was really writing over the periods of time when I was just trying to fill the void. I had a couple of short stories that were or one short story that was published earlier this year, plus another one that's going to be coming out in August. And I'm also continuing to work. I have some longtime friends out in Southern Ontario still who own a video game company called Hard Mode Games, and they are working on an original IP, and I've been their head environmental story writer. So they tell me the story bits that they want, and I kind of flesh out the world for them. So I've been doing their world building for them, and that's been an ongoing process as well. So that's kind of me dipping my toe into the video game world, but also still trying to tell these fantastical stories that I want to tell. And because I love these guys, they're fantastic. They've been friends of mine, one of them since grade 4. So I trust their vision, I trust their story, and I like what they have to say, and I'm honored to be able to contribute to it.
Okay, so all the short stories you were writing, are they all within the fantasy science fiction genres, or are you branching out into anything else?
They primarily are. One of the ones that the one that's going to come out in August is it's strictly science fiction. It's the first ever strictly science fiction that I've ever done. The one that I had printed earlier this year in another compilation that was very much along the lines of Death Dresses Poorly, in that it's a urban fantasy dark comedy. But lately, particularly inspired by my favorite book, I've been working more on the prose side and the more modern storytelling. My favorite book of all time is The Shipping News by Annie Proulx, which is a strange choice for a fantasy sci-fi reader and writer, but it was forced upon us in high school, and I devoured that book. And it's so incredibly rich and diverse. It's just a modern story. I don't even really know what to call it. I'm just going to call it modern fiction. It's not really a romance. It's not really anything. It's just a slice of life in rural Newfoundland for a beaten man. And it is just so magnificently written and descriptive that I've been trying to recreate a lot of things in short stories that are very similar to that. I mean, she won a Pulitzer Prize for it, so she did something right. I don't think it's such a weird thing to try and emulate. And a lot of things that I'm writing are not in any kind of weird science fiction fantasy world that I've crafted, but I always have ideas. Every kind of little snippet of an idea gets written down somewhere, and I will always attempt to come back to it because I've always got the sequel to Catching Hell in my head that I want to continue writing things in that world as well. So it's never very far away from what I'm working on at the time.
Cool. So while you're working on these short stories in this game, are you percolating ideas for your next novel, or have you gotten that far yet, or are you still germinating on things?
I've made it pretty far in another urban fantasy story. I'm coming up on about 50,000 words right now. I've set it aside and kind of sat on it because where I was when I started writing it is not kind of where I am now mentally and emotionally. And I want to make sure that if I'm going to continue down the road of writing that story, that I'm going to do it justice. It's a story that I started writing because I wanted to write something that my wife would read, because she doesn't read the kind of stuff that I normally do. Unless I'm reading it to her.
Right.
I wanted, I know what kind of things that she likes. I know the kind of genres that she likes, be it in TV, movies, or books. And I wanted to try and write something like that. And my brain hasn't been in that world for a little while, and I want to make sure I approach it right. But I mean, 50,000 is pretty good, but my goal for that book was 75. So I'm only 2/3 of the way there.
Okay. So I think that's everything I had from a good point of view. I'm just going to open it up to you at this point. If there's anything that hasn't been mentioned yet that you would like to discuss, other projects or anything that I think your listeners might find of interest, here's your chance.
Well, I will be at When Words Collide again because I just can't get enough of that. This will be my 4th year going, and every single year that I go there, it's always been a brand new experience from the fresh-faced time that I had when I first walked in there, and I felt like an absolute poser. I had absolutely no reason whatsoever being in the room with a lot of these people that I was in there with. But I ended up meeting another great author out of Edmonton, and we still get on really well to this day. And so I never miss When Words Collide. And I mean, this year, it's also the fact that I have a book coming out in this collection, and this collection is the new Enigma Front from the Imaginative Fiction Writers Association, which is here in Calgary, which is, again, me sitting in a room with a bunch of people a whole lot more talented than I am, but I was fortunate enough to have a short story coming out in that. That's the science fiction one that I mentioned. So that one is going to be, it's called Highlight Hard Case is the name of the story, and I'm so looking forward to the release of this story because I really want to read all the stuff that I get to share space with, because I know these authors and I've seen their work before, and I am humbled to be there. So I'm looking forward to that. So cool. For anybody who is going to be at When Words Collide, reach out to me. I'm all over the socials, and I love meeting people and talking to people and just sitting down and talking shop. I'd like to kind of consider myself an extremely relaxed author. I'm not going to make a living doing this in my life. I know that I'm not going to, and that's not my goal. I do this as a hobby. I do this for fun. I'm serious about it. I take it seriously, but I'm going to be one of those people who's going to one day buy a cabin on a lake with a little writing nook, because that's just not going to be who I am. I know this about myself, and I am very comfortable with that. So if you want a kind of different perspective other than the getting yourself out there and making $1 million with this, I am happy to talk about that. I would love to do that.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll take you up on that offer because I'll be at When Words Collide as well. So I'll definitely be looking out for it.
And I look forward to meeting you face to face and continuing the conversation.
Yes. Absolutely. That's fantastic. So I guess this brings us to the close of our interview. I want to thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
And I want to thank you very much for having me. It's been great.
No problem. And you did that Wizard and Glass reference. You basically wrote your ticket for the podcast. So you're always good after that.
It is easily one of my top 5 books. Easily. I
Cool.
cannot praise it enough. And the fact that it's becoming a TV show.
Yep. I'm so glad, because I was really worried after the movie. I thought, oh boy, this is going to lie dormant for a long time.
I know.
But and it was so sad because I really did like the cast. But yeah, there's no way you can start in the middle of a story and only make it a 90-minute movie. That was ridiculous.
You can't. When I saw the runtime of that movie, I'm like, okay, there's absolutely no way that this can be successful. I'm going to go to the movie. I'm going to support them and give them my money. But I know that I'm not getting a sequel.
Yeah. So it's with all these streaming platforms, it's a pretty good time for writers to get content adapted if that's what they're after.
It is.
Sure.
It is. If you are a good enough pitch man and you've got enough money behind you, you can have a misstep like The Dark Tower come out, and you can still, within the viewer's memory, come up with something to put out into the world of the same kind of genre or story.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it wasn't that long ago that we had Watchmen, and now we're getting Watchmen again. Like all these little things, it's the same. Just throw money at it and get somebody with a vision and the passion for it.
What's the other series? Pullman series with the polar bear.
I know.
I'm drawing a blank on it, but it's coming out as a series too.
Yeah, and I mean, Golden Compass was the movie.
Yes.
But I'm never going to remember the name of the actual series now that you've mentioned it, because I'm on the spot. 5 minutes after this conversation ends, I'll.
Absolutely, yeah, I'll be the same way.
But
all right, Mark. Well, I will let you go, and thank you very much.
Same here. Thank you very much.
All right, not a problem. Take care. Bye-bye.